This is the Debunking Economics podcast with Steve Keen and Phil Dobbie.
The archives.
Episode 90. Banks will be banks. Can technology change that?
Hello, I'm Phil Dobbie and welcome to another edition of the Debunking Economics podcast with Professor Steve Keen. Today, everyone likes to have a dig at the banks. They charge too much, they distort the economy, they don't invest enough in business, and many are looking to technology to sort out that imbalance, to remove the power of the bank. But are they expecting too much? After all, banks will always be banks. Yes, whether it's that peer-to-peer approach that puts lenders and borrowers together or cryptocurrencies that try and develop currency trading without the middleman, technologists are trying to find ways that banks are cut out of the equation. But will they succeed, or do we actually need banks? Well, one of our listeners says he's got into cryptocurrencies because it was a way of avoiding the banks, beating them at their own game, because transactions are managed without the middleman. And that's very much the internet model, isn't it? For lots of things. We book hotels and airline tickets now without going to a travel agent, so we cut out the intermediary. Can technology mean we can ever really cut out high street banks? What do you reckon, Steve?
It's possible in some parts of the world where banks are not dominant already, like Africa, to imagine a world where it isn't banks people transact through, it'd be mobile phones with transactions. And in fact, because a lot of some very innovative technology, which is obviously fintech style, because a lot of people don't have smartphones in Africa, what they've done instead is a lot of the phones transmit by, you put a phone to a phone, and then it sends a piece of sound, which is an encrypted verification of the person's transaction. So they've then managed to, so you put two phones together, bang, you transfer money between bank accounts, also linked to those telephones. Now there's a place where it's all been done by the telecommunications companies, and the financial companies are out of the loop. But of course, in the background, you have a telecommunications company, which is the central.
Yeah, it's acting like a bank itself, isn't it? Yeah,
that's right. It's another, the whole definition of a bank, and this was what Augusto Graziani's research as part of the Circuit School of Economic Theory was so important to me in building my own approach to modeling this stuff. I said that a transaction in capitalism involves promises to pay the third party. Now, that third party, he said, is nowadays a bank, but it doesn't have to be. In this case, it's becoming a telecommunications company. Now, what is really the objective of the Bitcoin end of the cryptocurrency world is to get rid of that trusted third party completely. So rather than having a third party, they have what they call proof of work or proof of, I've forgotten the other one. I'm not an expert in the technology by any means, but they have numerous people who are running computer programs trying to solve a set of mathematical puzzles that'll generate a string of zeros. In the first person to find the right string of zeros to verify a particular block of transactions is valid, they both get the fees for the transactions and they get some proportion of the Bitcoin that haven't yet been mined. Now, what that means is rather than having a single point, which is doing the verification and the promise of a single, it's the verification by a large array of people that this is a valid transaction.
But by sidestepping banks, you're actually also saying we're sidestepping the regulators, and does that become an issue? Because surely, I mean, it's fine that it's verified, the transaction has happened, but is someone using it for money laundering, for untoward purposes? I mean, do we need to regulate? I think the answer is yes, isn't it?
I think so, because what's actually happening a lot of the Bitcoin price, and this is admitted to by some of the people who are great fans of Bitcoin, is that there are people doing what are called pump and dump strategies. So you have a group of people with a certain amount of Bitcoin in their possession who coordinate a buy at one particular point in time, coordinate it with people promoting Bitcoin on social media at the same time. Some fairly famous people have been accused of doing this. In return for a fee of Bitcoin themselves to push up the price. So they pump up the price. A lot of suckers come in, rising, and they also think it's going to be a rising tide, and then the initiators sell out and cream the money coming in from the previous group. Now, this was a common tactic in 19th century stock markets. And one reason stock markets have been regulated ineffectively, but not a lot, is to stop this sort of thing happening. So pump and dump schemes, all that sort of stuff is quite illegal. And anybody who does it ends up with the corporate regulator stuff. I mean, the corporate regulator are pretty ineffective, but that's the whole idea. It's an anti exploiting the uninformed public. That's why insider trading is such a crime. You know, so
we're sidestepping banks and we're replacing it with something which is potentially much worse.
That's right, because this is why we regulated stock markets. Yeah. Now, I just haven't seen anybody whinging about regulation of stock markets, except that it's not effective enough.
Yeah,
and so what's being allowed in Bitcoin and all the cryptocurrencies is stuff which is, for good reason, has been made illegal in stock markets.
Now, Christine Lagarde from the IMF, she wrote a paper late last year for the Foundation for Economic Education. She says she thinks cryptocurrencies could replace existing financial systems. Not now. She thinks it's a way off in the future. She says they're too volatile, they're too risky, they're too energy intensive, and of course that's the other point, that because you're tracking every single transaction, then it can only handle 3 transactions per second. That's an issue if we were to see it as a common currency. And related to that, then she says, the underlying technologies are not scalable. Many are too opaque for regulators, and some have been hacked. But many of these technological issues could be addressed over time, she says, and they could feasibly replace banks. But you do have that issue of obviously regulation. The other issue is what about money creation? I mean, banks create money.
Yeah, this is. I mean, if I'm just looking at the very first block in Bitcoin right now, which you can find on the Wikipedia, of course. Actually, it's n.bitcoin.it/wiki/genesis_block. It says the Times, 3rd of January 2009, Chancellor on brink of second bailout for banks. ... So Satoshi literally wrote that code, that text into the very first Bitcoin. So there's always been an element of libertarian and justified rebellion against the banks built into these technologies. Now, the trouble is you can be so angry at your enemy that your anger means you don't analyze their tactics properly and you lose the battle with them. This is what I think has happened with Bitcoin, because a lot of crypto people believe gold is money. Now, I've tried that myself. I've gone down to the shop with a bar of gold and tried to buy a cornetto, and they won't take it.
I haven't got change for that. Yeah, that's right.
I haven't got change for that. Yeah.
here's a piece of gold with little tiny slither shaved off the edge in change.
Yeah, which is not. It simply doesn't happen. But what they want is a backed currency. Their vision is that the whole problem with the financial system is fractional reserve banking, and the fact that it's not backed by anything. And as I'm saying, guys, fractional reserve banking is a textbook stuff-up. It doesn't happen. It can't happen. And money has never been backed by a commodity except during times of social breakdown like the 100 Years' War or the 30 Years' War in Europe, where mercenaries refused payment in the king's coin because they weren't certain the king would be there to deliver on it. They wanted payment in silver or gold to fight their battles. But otherwise, we have always relied upon a credit system, which the backing for which ultimately is the fact you're living in a particular country where that country's currency is accepted in transactions. So you accept the king's coin. This is the thing for Britain. So they don't realize they didn't hand around coin. They hand around sticks, little pieces of wood called tally sticks. That was the basis of transaction. We've lost that record courtesy of burning down Parliament House in the early 1800s by accident. But if we'd seen that, people would have been no doubt that it wasn't a silver or gold backing. It was trust in the system that administered the tally sticks. Now, the same thing applies today. What actually enables us to do transactions, if you and I might not like the banks, we trust them that they will do. When you have a certain balance shown in the account, if you say, I want to withdraw that balance, they say, okay, here's the cash, or here's the transfer to Steve Keen's account to pay for that terrible podcast you did last week, yada, yada, yada. It's the trust that is the element. And what they're saying, we don't want to have to rely upon a trusted third party. The trouble is what they've done has meant that you've got you've got
you still got to have trust in the currency they've created. You still got
and the people who are holding it. So there's so much untrustworthy behaviour happening behind Bitcoin itself that they've brought themselves back into the wild west of pre-regulated stock markets.
So I mean, aside from cryptocurrencies, I mean, there are technologies that exist, and I think there's 1 million of these now where people do a fairly good job of matching investors with companies. So we've got the money in from people who want to invest. We're going to loan that money out to companies that want to spend it, which is fine. Maybe you are doing that without involving banks, so you're sidestepping the bank. But you're not creating money in the way that banks can, are you? I mean, you don't have that license to print money in the way banks can.
This is part of it. I got a bit distracted in the previous rave, but that's what the Bitcoiners themselves are against. They don't like the fact that banks can. They think money should be fixed. Now,
so you don't spend it if it doesn't exist.
Well, they're not so fixed. I've got a guy called Mike Lavazza. I think I've got him one of my Twitterer followers, and he's this avid. Every time there's a chance to say gold should be money, and you shouldn't be able to create it, he'll come in there and show any stuff and have a attack it. And I can't be bothered replying to him. He's so damn. He just doesn't even listen. Okay, but that's the sort of message. They don't believe gold. They believe there can be a world in which money does not increase in scale. It's fixed. And they think prices can fall. Now, that's a world without credit. And that's an interesting concept. You could try it on Mars because there's no previous existing society that has to cope with it. And I would recommend against Elon Musk highly against doing that, by the way. But you could give it a try there because it hasn't been done before. But they want a complete and utter social revolution, which they think is a return to normality. And this is partly the problem. It would be a totally new experiment to have a money supply which did not grow over time and prices having to fall. And pardon me, again, this is can be an economic myth that prices can adjust. Oh, pardon me, too much. There's this economic myth that prices can adjust. So rather than having rising amount of money, we can have falling prices. When you look at the actual history of price setting, it never falls that rapidly. The economic textbook myth of a instantly adjusting price is another myth. And so they're combining a couple of myths out of economic theory that capitalism is a barter system and that prices adjust instantly, and creating a currency based on those myths, and they think they're being radical. That's what bugs me. They're not.
So does that mean they're doomed to failure then, just because of this inability to create money? If you whatever the system you're using, whether it's if you're matching money, if you're trying to take out that third party, that third party is the third party that's actually creating that extra cash. They're creating that credit. If you don't do that, then it's just people with money lending to people who want money, and that's going to slow the whole system down and also constrain the money supply.
Yeah, I mean, you could design a cryptocurrency where it was designed to grow over time. But the trouble is then, again, how much is that an encouragement to sharks to get in there and sell your crap in the first place? To cream the money off for themselves. And this has been happening willy-nilly in some of the like international coin offerings that are out there. I even saw there was one initial coin offering for a company which is going to produce organic bananas. and I mean, okay, maybe it'll work, but that's just screwed. When you see that sort of stuff coming forward. And in that sort of world, you want to say, okay, prove it. Show me the banana plantation. And that's where regulation comes in.
Yeah, well, here's the thing. So Ross, who's one of our listeners who got involved in a cryptocurrency, was doing a travel around Europe trying to spend his cryptocurrency. And there are cash machines where you can supposedly get the cash out. But guess what? They're always empty or weren't getting refilled, or he'd have to come back middle of next week to try and get a hold of his money. So it sounds like, there's sort of an infrastructure being set up, but no one believes it. It's almost as though they've said, well, yeah, we'll create all of this. We'll allow people to speculate. We'll argue that, yes, you can use it as real money, but we're not really going to put much effort into that. Really, it's just making a quid out of the speculation and
getting the price up. And that's a huge part of it. It's one of the reasons the Bitcoin price rose so much is it was very easy to get in and extremely hard to get out. So there's buy-side pressure built into the technology. So, yeah, that's all these sorts of issues are coming forward now. And what you're doing is relearning some of the lessons that were learned during the 19th century, particularly in America and Australia, where they allowed private banks to develop the issue of their own money. And you find a wonderful collection of notes on the internet, which are these notes, of the paper notes, obviously, produced as currency by private banks. So the private banks had to themselves get registered at a state level in most cases by showing they had a certain amount of land or asset backing. But they would do all sorts of fraudulent, nefarious stuff. It's once they'd issued the money to get it accepted for either real assets or for greenbacks, and then disappear. And it was called the era of wildcat banking because they said yes, it's easy to get deposit your money. When you wanted to withdraw your money, the branch you had to withdraw by was, quote unquote, where the wildcats are.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're getting a similar sort of thing happening now.
Well, it does get to the case, doesn't it? Whatever you do to try and avoid banks, you're probably going to want to pull the same tricks at the end of the day, and that means that you do become a bank. So if you look at like people used to use barter card in Australia, which allowed you to provide a service and get so much for it, and those points could then be used to buy another service. The problem was it was never a service that you didn't get very much for it, and all the services you wanted to buy was stuff you didn't want anyway. So it didn't really work. There's this thing called money which allows you to buy anything you want from anyone, and that seems to work pretty well. So this approach from barter card didn't work. But if they had got traction, I guess the next stage they want to do then is to say, well, okay, when you want to buy something, what happens if you want to buy stuff that is more than you've earned? Well, let's give you the ability to borrow. And then you really are getting into money creation. They're creating their own barter dollars. And the question is, who's going to regulate them to make sure that they can pay that money back? The answer is the regulator has to get involved. Then they are a bank.
Yeah, I think this is what's starting to dawn on people in various ways, that you can use the technology to replace some of the verification systems that exist in banks. Frankly, I've got to look and say, how does it actually do that? How does this proof of work actually take the place of somebody checking and seeing whether that purchase by somebody in Denmark was actually by that person or by somebody who'd stolen their details? But this is the idea you can get rid of the centralized part. That is the thing which I think is another Achilles heel here, because with Bitcoin, the idea you have a huge number of people all competing to find it, to prove that it's unique. That means an enormous amount of data streaming around the internet from one person, one group, a miner to another, until one is actually successful. So there's a gigantic use of data and, of course, also energy in the process too. And maybe give up on the idea of having a distributed system, have a centralized one. The question is, how do you make sure you can trust the centralized one? That's more important than trying to avoid the centralization holus bolus as Bitcoin tries to do. And of course, this thing's, yes, you've just become a bank. Congratulations.
Yeah, and if you are using it's a distributed ledger technology, I think is what they call it, isn't it? If you are doing that, then how do you regulate? How do you see how this money is moving around? How do you prevent money laundering? And
then that's where the countries get involved as well, because
they're going to say, well, we want a centralized system. We don't like this distributed system because it's hard for us to track.
And the regulators will come in and try to break it up, and they'll blame the regulators for doing it. But again, a lot of this stuff has been developed by libertarians that don't believe the state should exist. Well, whether you believe it should or it shouldn't, it does. Yeah. And if you're going to go to a world where you think it doesn't exist, then
go to Mars.
You could expect them to fight back. So tough shit, guys. I mean, if you're going to try to take on the state and believe you can get rid of it and get angry when the state comes back and tries to stop you, duh.
So where does it end up? Here's a pretty good analogy. Skype was set up as a distributed way of handling phone calls. The idea was that it wasn't centralized. You pinged off other people's internet access to make phone calls. So it was peer to peer. Who owns Skype now?
Microsoft.
And I'm fairly certain it's driven off servers rather than peer-to-peer.
And it's also become typical Microsoft that designed it in such a way that you're desperately looking for an alternative.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So which
we're using, of course.
Yeah. So what started as almost subversive, it's a way of avoiding the tolls of phone companies, has now become part of the mainstream. I suspect the same thing's going to happen here, isn't it?
I think so.
All right, good to talk as always, Steve. We'll catch you again. You do realise there's going to be a whole load of crypto fanatics who are going to respond to this one.
I'm not going to be ducking virtual knives for the rest of the month. Yeah, I'm used to it.
Thank God they're only virtual. We'll survive.
Indeed. Be back. My balls have been virtually cut off.
We'll be back to fight another one. All right, we'll see you next time.
Okay, mate, bye.
And speaking of next time, we're going to look at the question of whether skilling up can improve productivity. If we send more people into higher education, is that going to improve the level of productivity within this country? That's next time on the Debunking Economics podcast with Professor Steve Keen. I'm Phil Dobbie. I'll be back for that one too. Thanks for listening.